Thanks, everyone today. Thanks for joining today, our Illinois Connected Community Adoption Cohort meeting. Happy to have you here in real time, and then as well as folks who will be seeing this recorded. We've got a great lineup of speakers today, and I think it's going to be a nice, both very practical, interesting content, as well as things that are going to be immediately valuable for you to know. Today we have Dustin Lee. He's with ITDRC, which is the IT Disaster Recovery Corporation or cooperative or center. I see now in back of him. So those C's are tricky on the acronyms. But Dustin was referred to me by Dana McKenzie, another Benton colleague, and she talked about the great work that they had been doing in Washington State that she had heard about and wanted to bring this opportunity to our Illinois connected communities. Dustin, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill. It's great to be here with all of you. Bill and I, we chatted about a month and a half ago around broadband and what Benton was doing in the Chicago and the Illinois areas. But we also talked about what our nonprofit is doing, ITDRC. Bill got it pretty close. So it's the Information Technology Disaster Resource Center. It's definitely an acronym. It's definitely a mouthful. But we're essentially a 501c3 that responds to disasters by bringing technology into these disaster affected areas. So I thought I'd probably give all of you maybe a little bit of background about who we are as an organization, but especially to talk a little bit about what we're doing around COVID-19. We do have a free community Wi-Fi hardware and installation offering for communities across the country. And that's definitely something that we want to identify additional sites where we can help improve and increase access to broadband. To date, we've done just a little preview. We've done more than 700 of these sites, partnering with schools and libraries and community centers. But I'll get a little bit more into that after I talk about the org. Bill, how much time do you want, or how deeply do you want me to go into this? I know there are some other folks who are presenting as well, so I don't want to step on them. Bill, you're muted.
Yes, you're fine, Dustin. Like we had talked about, I think about 20 minutes or so. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. So if you don't mind, I'll share a few slides with you all. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions at any time. I know what we do is a little bit unusual, so feel free to just unmute yourselves and let me know if you have any questions or raise your hand. I think Zoom is the thing now. So let me drop a slide up here. All right, so we have a really long mission statement. I'm actually gonna skip most of this because it's pretty boring, but I like to share photos with that kind of show you what we do. Disasters are really our bread and butter. This was a dam failure in the Michigan area that you may have heard of sometime in the middle of last year. This dam failure obviously affected the community infrastructure. And what we see a lot of times in these sorts of disasters is the cell service will go down, or the internet service will go down, or the power will go down, which affects both the cell and internet services. And when you have first responders who go into these disaster areas, whether it is these dams or wildfires or hurricanes, what you really need as a responder is the ability to coordinate that response, and that really requires the ability to communicate with all your partners in that disaster area as well as outside of the area. So, for example, if you imagine that you're the Red Cross and you want to bring in shelters for all the displaced residents, you're in a disaster area, you've lost your cell coverage, so you can't send emails, you can't send SMS, you can't make phone calls. So what do you do in that situation? So our organization, we specialize in bringing technology and communications, especially into these disaster areas. And we support both nonprofits as well as government entities. So that's, fire, EMS, and emergency operations centers and things like that. So we do a lot of kind of satellite stuff. We do a lot of Wi-Fi. We do a lot of voice, pretty much anything IT related. We even set up charging stations so that folks who've been affected are able to recharge their devices. So that's kind of one general offering that we have, and it's our most common thing. So like tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires. That's our like I said, our bread and butter. But we've also been doing our COVID-19 response, which we call Project Connect, and this is it's a very different type of disaster, COVID-19, than what we normally work in. But we definitely recognize that it has affected communities across the country, especially the families with children who need to have access to get online. All of you on here, I'm sure, are very well familiar with the issues with digital equity and all the economic and educational problems that come along with that. And in our view, COVID-19 is its kind of own disaster, which has really just really widened that gap and forced you to have that connection in order to be able to access your education online, or to access telemedicine, or to access digital banking. These are things that are really required, or really require the internet in order to function in today's modern society. Now, with schools and libraries being closed, many of those facilities where community members may have gone to access the internet as a resource, those facilities have been closed, and in many cases, those facilities, the Wi-Fi just kind of sits within those buildings, doesn't reach outside of the buildings. So that makes it really difficult for community members to access the internet. So we've seen, for example, folks kind of pressed up against the side of the building, a school building or a library building or a fire hall, trying to get that little bit of Wi-Fi signal that's leaking out of the building. So what we're doing is we're offering and have been installing Wi-Fi across the country. So really leveraging the existing backhaul that has been in place from these schools, libraries, municipal halls, community centers, and really broadening the area of coverage for that Wi-Fi. So, for example, in this case, we pushed it out into a parking lot area. We pushed it out into green spaces, so parks, pavilions. We've done indoor kind of co-working spaces where students have been set up with kind of socially distanced online learning and childcare at the same time. So really anywhere it makes sense for community members to gather and to use Wi-Fi. That's kind of what we're trying to accomplish by increasing access. So we do provide free hardware, so the Wi-Fi hardware, as well as any kind of additional network gear. If we need switches, we have some of those, as well as the installation. So we have professional installers who are roaming around the country and doing installations like this. To date, we've done, this is kind of our overall operational deployment map. And each one of these dots represents one site that we currently have open. The vast majority of these pins are actually COVID sites today, while we do have a lot of hurricane sites and earthquake sites. We did a lot of work in Washington around partnering with the libraries and a nonprofit ISP and the State Department of Broadband there in order to increase that access to residents across the state. So a lot of these pins are at the schools and libraries. Probably more than half of our sites are schools and libraries. And then the balance are anywhere from those municipal halls, police stations, to very small rural country stores where that's really the only host facility available in the area that has some sort of internet available. And then closer to you all, we have quite a few sites in Michigan, more than 50 sites operational in Michigan. Many of these are in rural areas, so talking about the dam disaster that was kind of up in mid-Michigan there, but also many in kind of inner city areas. And the challenge there is, of course, in rural areas, the challenge is often lack of infrastructure. So lack of ISPs, lack of especially cable or DSL. Sometimes you have WISPs, but they have very low data caps or just are very slow. But we also see challenges in these kind of urban areas where the issue is less infrastructure and more affordability. So in these cases, for example, in Detroit, we partnered with a great nonprofit called Brilliant Detroit.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The nonprofit's name is Brilliant Detroit.
Brilliant Detroit. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And what their mission is to try to increase or try to improve childhood outcomes, access to education very early on. So they've set up centers all over Detroit, kind of in neighborhoods where children are able to go and obtain access to the kind of after-school programs and support. But of course, during the pandemic, all of those centers were closed. So they needed to bring that education outside, and they also wanted to make sure that their residents had access to the online schooling. So we partnered with them to put Wi-Fi on the outside of their buildings across the city, as well as in this case, we also had a number of churches and schools and other kind of community type buildings as well. So that is really what we've done in a nutshell. So more than 700 sites. This is, I guess, this report we generated more than or almost a month ago. But more than 700 sites across the country we've opened to date. And we are continuing to look for ways that we can continue to make impact as a nonprofit. So obviously there are some gaps in the middle here that we'd love to fill. And that's why we are here on the call with you today. So we'd love to kind of work with communities across the country to identify these right sites where it makes sense to install indoor or outdoor Wi-Fi. Again, we will provide the hardware and installation completely free of charge. The hardware will remain with the community. It's really a kind of a grant to the community so that they can do whatever it makes sense to do with it. While our normal hurricanes and wildfires will recover the equipment after the site shuts down, this is really intended as a permanent installation because we understand that we're addressing a problem that has existed before COVID-19 and will continue to exist after COVID-19 if we ever get past this. So yeah, it's really meant to be a continual asset to the community over the long term.
Can I ask a question, Dustin? Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Can you say that these are permanent, these COVID response ones? Can you just give me an indication of the speed generally that's being generated off of these Wi-Fi, or is it vary by site?
It does vary by site. So, and that's a great question. So I should mention that we do have kind of two limitations on what we can do as a nonprofit. One is due to, actually they're both really due to limitations on the resources that we have as a nonprofit. One is that we can't unfortunately pay for ISP connections or any recurring costs in general. So we won't unfortunately be able to buy a Comcast subscription or a CenturyLink subscription or whoever that is. That's something that usually is incumbent on the host facility to provide. However, we have done some sites where we've been able to pull Wi-Fi from one area to another through point-to-point or point-to-multipoint links. For example, we're working with a tribe in California, and they have no kind of landline ISPs. We're working with a college nearby, several miles away, to see if we can source connectivity from them and do a point-to-point shot to get it over there. Those point-to-point shots tend to be much more tricky. If you've ever been involved in the point-to-point planning, we have to find the vertical assets or find the line of sight in order to make that work. So we do prefer to partner with schools or libraries or community centers or fire stations that may already have some sort of broadband. In many cases, schools have already been connected with fairly high-speed connections. So those are usually great candidates, and that's probably why we've done more than 50% of them with schools and libraries. The second limitation that we have is that we don't do individual residences in general. We're trying hard not to become an ISP ourselves. It's really, while we love to be able to get every residence connected, that's just very difficult to scale nationally. So we do try to find these kind of focal points in the community, like with Brilliant Detroit, where they had these learning centers spread throughout neighborhoods, or libraries as anchor institutions or schools as anchor institutions. So those are really our two limitations there. And then to answer, Adrian, your question, then yeah, the speeds will depend very much on the backhaul that's available at the host facility.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine. Thank you very much.
And actually, that's really all I really want to share with all of you. Are there any other questions that I can answer for you about our offering, or how to get involved, or how to identify the right sites, or how to request an installation?
Hi, Dustin. I have a question about the installation.
Yeah.
So you said that your organization would put the hardware and installation and complimentary. If I'm a community organization, do you have any idea of how much it would cost us to have a ISP connection? Just a ballpark range?
Sure. That'll depend a lot on your locality. I imagine if you're in an urban area, actually, I'll probably ask someone else to answer it for your particular area. I know the other states, but maybe someone can answer for Illinois.
Okay, thank you.
So Linda, it's going to be about, do you have a Comcast connection that you would purchase?
Okay.
And they would, because that backhaul is the underlying, who's the ISP that has the fiber that allows these wireless units to be connected to. Please.
Okay. So,
right. So when he says the community, so for instance, if you had a school that had Wi-Fi to the school and in the school, you're using that Wi-Fi, and likely that would be, free because you're taking the Wi-Fi from the school. But if you were to put it someplace where there wasn't already a connection, you'd be pulling it from AT&T or Comcast or RCN or WOW, who were the four providers, in the Chicago area.
And so what is the ask of those companies? Because Comcast is in our community. If we were interested in doing it, what do I ask them about, in a ballpark on how much we should be expected to spend to set up a new one? Let's act like we don't have it at a school or something like that.
So that's about, Linda, that's about $100 a month, so value. I mean, so it's a regular, it's just, it would be like calling up Comcast and saying, if you had an organization to pay for it, you could just ask Comcast to give you a standard service, 100 megabit service or 200 or whatever you could afford. And then they would charge you, it'd just be a line, an access, a subscription to them.
Okay.
Although you might say, well, that's something they should just provide to the community as a community benefit. Or the other option is, if you have a neighborhood network has an office and they've got internet at the office, that they could connect this access point into their existing internet service and provide that out to the community. So they could partition off a part of that internet connection for public access.
Okay, thanks. So Dustin, I have one more question. You said you take care of the hardware and the install. So if there's any right of way issues or city issues, you take care of that, or is the community expected to take care of that?
So if we're talking about the installation of the internet, that's usually something that Comcast or the ISP would take care of. If we are talking about permission to install the access point on a building, that would be something that we would work with the host facility to figure out. So I know some libraries, for example, they're in these strip malls, which are commercially rented properties. So in the past, we've basically had a conversation with the property manager just to help them understand what this is going to look like. I know there's oftentimes some aesthetic concerns around that, but we've never actually run into any issues where these property managers have decided not to go forward with it.
Okay.
We do sometimes find occasionally issues with community boards who are maybe like select boards or city councils. And it really is just kind of a matter of messaging and kind of convincing them that this is truly free. I know that for many communities, this sounds like a offer that's too good to be true. Free hardware, free installation. But so I guess just a little bit of context. Our nonprofit, we partner with a lot of tech companies. So very early on in the pandemic, Ruckus, which is a wireless, they manufacture wireless hardware. They donated almost $1 million of equipment to do this sort of project for us. And then we've also partnered with other, all the names that you know from Silicon Valley. We have some very generous donations from some of those companies, but also we have about 2,300 volunteers, many of which come from those companies themselves. So we have volunteers from Ruckus, we have volunteers from Cisco, we have volunteers from Google, and all the others. So that's how we fund our operations. And I know that sometimes is a question like, is this a real thing? And yes, there's no strings attached to us. You can't pay us unless you really want to. We welcome donations, but yeah, we're happy to partner with communities, and our goal is really to try to close that gap in access. So.
All right. And so do you maintain the equipment that you install, or do you train the community to maintain? Talk to me about what happens with maintenance.
That is a great question, Linda. So we can do both. So if the community is able to identify a point of contact that is able or would like to learn how to manage the equipment, we can pretty easily provide that access and kind of turn that equipment essentially over to them to manage over the long term. And that's really what we prefer, to be honest. We don't really want to become, we don't really want to support 700 sites across the US. So if we can help the community kind of take ownership of the equipment that we install, that's our preference. We don't really have any formal training around that, but we do welcome community members to shadow our installers. We do welcome them our installers can give them kind of a little rundown on how the configuration and management works. It's all through a web UI usually. And it's pretty simple from there. It's usually the biggest problems that we see as far as support and maintenance are someone inadvertently unplugging the access point because they wanted to charge their phone or something like that. On the other hand, we've done some libraries which we know are one-person shows. So the director is the facilities person who is the IT person, and they just don't have the expertise or maybe the time to manage these access points. And in those cases, we will keep the access point on our cloud-based controller and be able to remotely manage them and support them. So we do have a ticketing system. So we have an email address that people can email for support, as well as a phone number if they need help in real time.
All right, thank you.
Dustin, two questions. One is, can you talk a little bit about if somebody has an existing internet connection, if people are going to share that over this public Wi-Fi, is there configurations, security configurations that take place to segment that out?
That's a great question. And that's something that we always review with the host facility before we do the installation. So we do, to your point, Bill, want to ensure that installing these public Wi-Fi access points don't expose the host facilities to additional security risks. So for oftentimes we work with schools to implement kind of a VLAN segmentation to ensure the traffic is segregated from the public side and the private side. We do also, on all our access points by default, have configuration that prevents access to the LAN. So you know, someone on the outside will be able to access the gateway, the default gateway, but not any of the other devices on the LAN side.
Okay. And then issues around filtering, any kind of discussion there?
Good question as well. So in some cases, I know libraries and schools, they've got E-rates, so they've got SIPA concerns there. In many cases, we can just write it on top of their existing SIPA filters if they need to. In some cases, they've asked us to implement SIPA filtering. And we do have DNS-based filtering available, yeah, we do have it available. But I think in the majority of the installations that we've done, we've just kind of used, if they have a requirement for that, we've used their existing infrastructure for that.
Okay, thank you. And then, so if I was, let's say I'm a county economic developer thinking about broadband and I wanted to increase public access, the path for me to work with you would be to do my drive around my county and try and find out where there's gaps in Wi-Fi connectivity, where there's opportunities, maybe hosts, and essentially create that list and email it to you. Is that right?
That's definitely one way to do it. Yeah, you can work with, you can do a drive, see where the gaps are. You can reach out sometimes to schools. Oftentimes they often want to get their students online. So just making that connection between the schools, oftentimes it's their principal or their IT department and us. That's definitely a good way to do it. Libraries as well. When they're closed, they want to make sure they're still serving their patrons. So making the connection between your local library or library system and us, that's also really helpful. And then to get us, and then I guess churches, fire halls, police stations, really any sort of community area that makes sense, even private businesses. Like I said, in some of these really rural areas, the business is kind of that community anchor institution. So we're happy to install there as long as it benefits the entire community, as long as they don't require you to be a patron of the facility. Our litmus test is does what we're doing benefit the entire community? So as long as it fits in that, that's kind of good with us.
Okay. Sounds
Once
good.
The institutions are identified, I would encourage folks to they can either put us in touch and put them in touch with us directly, shoot them our email, or I also put our website in the chat here. And that's really our preferred way of collecting information. So on this website, which is at itdrc.org/projectconnect, we do have a Google form here. It basically asks for information like who are the right contacts for the site, what is the address for the site? Is there an ISP already at this location? what areas are you trying to cover with Wi-Fi? And then are there other contacts like, is there a facilities person that we need to work with? Is there an IT person we need to work with? And so that's how we kind of collect the information that we need to do the install. However, I will say that if you don't have all this information, don't worry. Only the first page of this is really required, which is really your contact information. And then we can work with you to figure out the rest of the pieces as we plan out the install.
Well, it couldn't be easier.
Really, Dustin, this is terrific. Thank you so much.
Dustin, my final question is, as vaccinations roll out and the pandemic winds down, it seems like timing here is of the essence if people want to get in on this program.
Yes, we certainly encourage folks to take advantage of this as early as possible. Obviously, the sooner we can install this, the more benefit it will provide to the community. We do also have a limited amount of resources, so I would encourage you all to try to queue up or get into our installation queue before those resources are exhausted.
Good. Anything else? Thank you so much. Any last?
Yeah, just a couple last things. So on this Project Connect page, I just want to highlight that we do have a frequently asked questions document here. So over our 700 installs, we've accumulated quite a few questions and try to answer a lot of them. So we encourage you to take a look at that, especially if you're looking for technical information on that VLANing and segmentation that you were talking about, Bill. We've also got some photos. So we talked a little bit about aesthetics. We try to keep it neat, and we have some photos that will show you kind of typical installs. And then a one-page flyer. So if you're driving around and you want to do some outreach and you just want to have something physically to hand out or to send or email, we do have a one-pager that you're welcome to print out or to distribute otherwise. And that's a great way also to get people, make people aware of what we have to offer.
Good, great. Well, when I told people about this, they thought it was too good to be true. So I'm glad we brought you on to show that it's a real thing here. And to me, it just looks like a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you all. Really great to be here. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me. I welcome, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. projectconnect@itgrc.org. That'll get to us. And I will also, if you want to contact me directly, this is my cell, so you can give me a ring or send me a text, and that is me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some dots on the Illinois map. That's what I say.
I'm excited
Good,
about
great.
that.
Thank you, Dustin. Up next, we're really excited to have John Horrigan present. And Adrian, I'm just going to call on you a little bit. You and John are colleagues from way back. Do you want to do an introduction for him?
Oh, yes, I'd be delighted to.
I know you don't need a slide for it.
No, I was just going to say, well, I don't know, how long has it been, John? I guess it's been close to a decade. We're getting there. But John is best known for being the lead researcher on the National Broadband Plan, which was created in, boy, John, I want to say 2009-10, is that?
That's right, released in 2010.
Released in 2010. And then a lot of John's career was also spent at the Pew Charitable Trust, specifically the Pew Research Center. And John's expertise has always been in mostly on the adoption side and very much focused on libraries. John's a regular contributor to the Benton Digital Beat blog articles. So if you wanted to get onto the Benton site and get into the Digital Beat section, you'll see John listed there. And then the other connection that we have most recently is that John was one of the 3 researchers we used, the state of Illinois and the Benton Institute, to work on the Illinois affordability study, which we had to submit to the Illinois General Assembly on January 1st. So a lot of those big earth-shaking numbers to connect everybody in Illinois and connect people also below the poverty line were done as a result of looking at a lot of data sets available to us. And John was a part of that team along with Colin Rhinesmith and Brian Whitaker. So we've had a long relationship with John. He's written a bunch of reports for Benton's, particularly around the digital skills needed in workforce development and sort of the transition in that workforce and around libraries. So I'm really delighted that John, who has just finished a study about seniors and connectivity, would be here to present to us. And I'm just going to turn you over. The point is, I love the guy and I'm glad he's here to present to all of you. He's a very smart dude. Anyway, thanks, John, for being
Thanks,
here.
Adrian. And thanks, Bill, for having me here. What I want to do is today talk a little bit about, as Adrian was saying, a study I did recently in conjunction with OATS, which is Older American Technology Services. It was a project funded by the Humana Foundation that produced an Aging Connected report. And the idea was to look at data to try to understand the size of broadband adoption gaps for older Americans. So to prove that I have digital skills, I'm going to try to share my screen and show a few slides. And okay, I'm hoping
Yay.
seeing
Yeah.
something. So you're seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Good. You're not seeing my Gmail. That's good. That's good. So what I want to talk about today is, as I've said, older adults and the digital divide. So let me go through a few data points here, but a stage setting slide to begin with. I spend a lot of time talking about the digital divide, working with others in thinking about what the gaps are. And Adrienne mentioned I've been doing this for a little while now. And so when we worked on the National Broadband Plan 10, 11, 12 years ago, talking about broadband adoption was a lot simpler than it is today. Back then, it was basically whether you had a fairly clunky computer on your desktop with a wire attached to it, or at least a wire coming into your house that would beam out the Wi-Fi signals. So that was basically it in circa 2009. You have a computer, you have a broadband subscription, you're ready to go to town to use the internet. These days, of course, we're in a much different world. We have pervasive wireless networks. We have tablet computers. We have smartphones. So we have multiple different ways to get online. And among some people, there's an assumption that any device is as good as another device to get online. Any network is about as good as any other network to get online. So let's just measure who has it, who doesn't, and we're done. Well, not so fast. And particularly today with the pandemic, we've learned that not all internet access modes are created equal. So for that reason, when I talk about the digital divide, I sort of focus on 2 anchor assets for getting online: computers and wireline access. Why? Well, because if you're trying to do homework, if you're trying to do a telehealth session, having a sizable screen and a keyboard is awfully useful. That typically means a laptop computer or a desktop computer. And for the most part these days, as far as a network access means, the wireline access mode is the most robust. And by that, I mean it is has the fastest speeds and the most capacity for users. There's a question in the American Community Survey data that asks whether people subscribe to cable modem service, DSL service, or fiber optic services. That's what I mean by wireline access. And not only does that give you faster speeds than typical wireless networks, when you have a data plan for your wireless access data needs, you get a monthly limit. You get maybe 200 gigabits per month to do all your various surfing and so forth. And for homework, for video streaming, for telehealth sessions, you can eat through those 200 gigabits awfully quickly. Not the case with wireline access, which has usually 1+ terabit data limits that most users never touch. So in going through some data slides in a minute or two, we're going to be talking mainly about wireline access. And we'll talk about smartphones adoption for older adults. But just keep in mind, as I've been saying, smartphones are a modern wonder, unquestionably. They're great for text and social media and those sorts of things. They're not as good for all the network burdens that the pandemic has placed on us for doing homework, having telehealth sessions, and streaming video. So let's look at some data from the American Community Survey on digital access in the United States, comparing those 65 and older, which is the right side of the slide, to those age 18 to 64. And a first thing to notice is that you have 81% of households in the 18 to 64 age range having a broadband internet connection, meaning that wireline subscription of cable modem, digital subscriber line, or fiber optic. Toggle over, I'm sorry, that's 75%. I'm misreading my own slides, my apologies. 75% wireline for younger households and just 59% for older adults. And so immediately you see a gap for older adults vis-a-vis the rest of the country. The other point to look at is the smartphone. That's where the gap is quite substantial. So that's 90% of younger adults having a smartphone versus 67% of older adults. So if we think the smartphone somehow closes the digital divide, it's not doing that at a very rapid rate for older adults, since they're far less likely to have smartphones than younger adults. And I should say these numbers for the 65 and older cohort, and this is included in the Age and Connected report, the numbers, once you get to the 75 and over threshold, really sort of fall off the cliff for older adults. And you can see also that computer adoption, whether you're talking desktop, laptop, or tablet computers, there are also substantial gaps for older adults. And one thing to notice when looking at tablet computers and smartphones, the part of the story here is that the newer the gadget, the bigger the gaps for older adults. Smartphones, again, are the smartphone. I think the iPhone was released as we were developing the national broadband plan. So the smartphone as a consumer item is just a little more than a decade old. The tablet, a little newer than that. And you can see that older adults are generally last to the party for getting new gadgets. And as we know, applications developers optimize to new gadgets, and sometimes the very niftiest applications very quickly. And so that, leaving apart just the different ownership levels across age groups, applications are being built and optimized for the latest things very quickly, which even that exacerbates these kinds of divides between older adults and younger adults. A couple other points to bring out. That 59% wireline adoption rate for older adults translates into 22 million people aged 65 and over who lack wireline broadband at home. And that's bigger than the homework gap. So we hear a lot these days about the homework gap, the fact that many school children don't have the means at home to go online. We hear a lot about that for good reason, because If they can't get online with a wireline subscription, they're really hobbled for logging on for school. So the homework gap is a big deal in policy circles these days, as I said, for very good reasons. But for older adults, the gap in terms of the absolute number of people disconnected is larger. And we should understand that the consequences of being disconnected for older adults is serious in a way that's obviously different for school children, but particularly in a pandemic. Many seniors who live alone are socially isolated due to the pandemic. Having online access can help address that. Telehealth has exploded since the pandemic, and seniors have every reason to not want to circulate in the midst of a pandemic, so telehealth becomes quite important. And again, large numbers are disconnected per those data points. It is worth noting that the nature of these broadband adoption gaps leave more seniors disconnected than exist in the homework gap. The other point is that there are large adoption gaps for those with disability. Just 48% of seniors with a disability have a home broadband subscription. And finally, what's true generally in the digital divide is that race and ethnicity factors into it. African Americans and Hispanics are generally less likely to have broadband adoption or broadband internet subscriptions at home, and those gaps exist for older adults as well, and it's on the slide. The gaps on the order of 15 percentage points. What to do about it? We were talking a little bit about that just a few moments ago. Sort of the twin pillars of addressing gaps are digital skills training and discount internet offering. When you talk about the homework gap, oftentimes the focus is on the affordability part of the digital divide, because there's an assumption, which isn't always a good assumption, but there is an assumption that kids know how to use the internet, so they don't need digital skills training. And so the focus for the homework gap tends to be on discount internet offerings and less on digital skills training. Certainly for seniors, both matter, but the digital skills point is extremely important. And we hear a lot among digital inclusion practitioners these days about the need for digital navigators, which is to say people who are trained to help others on how to use the internet, who go physically into people's homes to help them troubleshoot. And I can tell you that's going to be crucially important for older adults to have these sorts of programs, which are starting to become a little more prevalent around the country, but I wouldn't call them widespread by any stretch of the imagination. But that, particularly for older adults, is going to be an important policy tool going forward. And where the funding comes from, we'll see. We'll see whether the bill that President Biden is apparently set to sign in just moments has some funding that can be used for those purposes. We'll just have to see how that plays out, or whether that is somehow folded into an infrastructure bill that the administration may try to do later this year. So with that, I will stop and open up to questions, and I hope I have answers.
John, did you identify best practices or organizations that are really leading this to address senior gap? Is AARP hot and heavy on this, or?
Yes, well, Oates, who did sponsor the study I'm talking about, let me unshare my screen, does provide that sort of service to seniors. So Oates now has a presence in a number of different places around the country. Initially, it was in New York City. So you could go to Oates centers and have that kind of digital skills training. So Oates is good with that. Oates is now sort of tethered to AARP. So AARP is starting to think about this more. Then other than that, these initiatives tend to, in some cases, spring up organically. I'll tell you that I live in Baltimore. I saw a news item on the local news within the past couple of weeks where a local church is providing those digital skills services for seniors and really digital navigation for dealing with how to figure out getting COVID vaccines and so forth. But OATS is one organization that pops prominently to mind.
Robbie, can you do me a favor and find the study that is that AARP did for the state of Illinois? I believe it was, yeah, that would be very good. And John, actually, this was a presentation at the last Illinois Broadband Advisory Council. AARP's rep sits on that advisory council, and they did a study that might interest the group here. But this has become a hot topic, John, as you know, because with the, I think particularly around vaccine signups for those priority groups, there's been lots written about how older people are having a very hard time navigating those sites and frustrations. I think the state of Connecticut just basically said, if you're a younger than the target age group and you bring in somebody that's over 75, then you can get vaccinated too, as a way to get around this inability of people to get online. I know my husband and I are in 1B in Illinois because we've hit that wonderful age of 65, and we are relatively digitally sophisticated and had such a hard time navigating these sites. So this has just been, it's just a critical problem at this point. Robbie, you finding it? I think it's in one of your newsletters, kiddo. Okay, sorry. I can see you going down being concerned. Anne, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, because we're interested in reaching out to our senior community, and is there a kind of like a for digital skills training, is there a is it better to have one-on-one or work in small groups? Are there any benchmarks for that?
I mean, I'm not sure that there are benchmarks or best practices. My hunch is unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, meaning both modes of training are important because it's going to vary by need. You know, I think for maybe signing up for a vaccination, that's probably going to be a one-on-one sort of thing. If you have seniors wanting to sort of refresh their basic digital skills once the pandemic permits it, I think one-to-many will probably be suitable for those kinds of applications. And libraries are natural resources for that kind of training.
I'm on a board. It's called CETA. It's a community action agency, and they do a lot of like LIHEAP, which is utility assistance, and other like WIC and things. And a lot of people using their cell phones, they can't, because their offices are closed during the pandemic, they can't download documents, and there's a gap. People fill out the applications, but then they can't get in the right documents. So what they ended up doing for seniors who had applied last year, they just used the documents from last year to make the funding go through. But I think we've only used 30% of our resources right now, funding, and it needs to be spent by June 30th. So it is a problem for the seniors.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be some need to sort of flood the zone with resources to try to address this. And Adrienne mentioned some work I've done on workforce development and broadband. You know, I think, or I believe that training people to help others develop their digital skills is an important workforce development initiative, which is to say, we know that with the recession caused by the pandemic, that occupational chairs are shifting. So if you worked in a restaurant last year, that restaurant job isn't going to be there once everything opens up, or it won't be there for a while, given the different composition of the workforce driven by the pandemic recession. Other jobs will start to hire and hire at fast rates. Lots of those jobs will require digital skills. They'll be better paying than some other kinds of service sector jobs. So if you're training people to train others on digital skills, you're in fact training that person with skills that are relevant to the 21st century workforce. So I think if policymakers look at that in two ways, there can be kind of a nice synergy there. You're solving a problem, which is how do you get seniors to vaccines? And you're solving another problem, which is how do you put people to work in fields that are likely to be growth fields in the future?
Mhm.
You know, it's one of the things I think is really critical is the idea that you can involve partners, like for seniors and e-banking. You know, the banks are an important part of the training environment for that they need to be right in there. The seniors probably trust the banks, you know, as trainers, which is good. And so I think that is a positive thing. The same thing with healthcare or wherever it's kind of a sector by sector, application by application as people need it. I think
Yeah,
it's
and you're
really an
kind of
important thing.
you're kind of hitting the trifecta of trusted institutions when you look at survey research. The first is libraries and librarians. Second are healthcare institutions, hospitals, doctors, and financial institutions rate well also. And so those are the places you turn to because, I mean, trust on things digital is a big deal for every age group, but seniors probably most of all.
And we all learn when it's right, something we need to know. That's when we're going to be most open to the learning,
Yeah.
as opposed to more generally, think of all the things you could do with this, right? It's if you drill down. I don't
was
know if you
gonna
can
say,
see the
Bill, there
chat,
was-
John,
Sorry.
but there's real questions by Nancy about your research. You knew about
Two
the
recommended
disparate
skills.
dollars.
So the question from Nancy is, for the two recommended strategies on skills training and discounts, did you get those from needs assessment and analysis? Yes. So I have research that I've done that shows that digital skills training does have a positive impact on the likelihood of people using the internet for education and job training. On the one hand, that sounds like kind of a no-brainer finding, but you do have skeptics who say that training really doesn't matter. When you have these training classes on computers, you're really just attracting people who are highly motivated and would probably learn anyway. The training itself doesn't matter. Not so according to the research that I've done that kind of controls for people's prior levels of motivation. So skills training makes a difference and discounts make a difference. Again, that sounds intuitive that if you have a cut rate discount plan, people will flock to it and good things will ensue. It's possible when you look at a particular area that positive changes in broadband adoption over time isn't due to discounts, but it's due to the fact that there has generally been an upward drift in broadband adoption in society throughout the years. But some of my colleagues have done work that's really tried to isolate whether the availability of discount offers makes a difference over and above what you might normally expect to witness in terms of the growth of broadband adoption. And the answer is yes, the discounts make a difference. They make a difference usually tethered with partnerships between the internet service providers and community institutions, which help get the word out and also overcome that trust issue that potential subscribers may have, since they might look a little bit askance at an internet service provider's discount offer. That skepticism might be overcome if they're getting the word from a local public library, a school, another trusted institution.
Then she also had a question about the ethnic disparities, racial disparities, and where that data came from.
So the data on the slide come from the American Community Survey, which is a large-scale survey run by the U.S. government, the Census Bureau, that surveys, literally millions of households per year. So from a survey perspective, you're getting a very large sample size, and that does let you break down adoption figures by race and by age, and that's where those figures came from.
So Nancy, also in Illinois, in the Illinois affordability study, that data came from the ACS, so you could get in and look specifically at Illinois. And we also broke it out by the 10 economic regions, so you could actually really zero in on my community is in this particular economic region and see how startling the gaps are. And as John pointed out, the seniors often, almost entirely, John, I think, beat the homework gap in terms of sheer numbers. So it just goes back to our problem. And I think there has been, I'm going to say this, it's not popular to say it, but it's been sort of from a policymaker perspective, it's easier to convince them that kids, should be addressed as a priority. And then I think what happens is that just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when you really drill down to the data, you start to see that we have a much bigger problem in that 65 plus group in terms of sheer numbers.
It's probably in the Illinois report. The number I'm going to give you is from a more recent report I did on Maryland, so the numbers are a little fresher in my head. But the size of the homework gap in terms of sheer numbers of households, that's 1/5 of the overall size of the adoption gap in the state of Maryland. So there's 500-some thousand households who don't have wireline broadband subscriptions in the state of Maryland. A little more than 100,000 are households with school-aged children. And that ratio is roughly going to be the same for the state of Illinois.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, we've certainly seen the schools rush to address the homework gap during the pandemic, but no real such effort for people without children, older adults, and so on, until now this emergency broadband benefit program that Robbie's going to talk about in a few minutes. So I think we've got a nice flow here going today on our conversation.
Robbie's put some good stuff in the chat. I just wanted to point that out to people. And I love Dustin's comment, so I'm glad you're on, Dustin. But he says for 2 recommended strategies, I'm sorry, it was the business about this is why they're getting lots of calls from senior centers for installations, which, that's actually a very nice thing to hear, that you're getting a lot of attraction with that community.
John, did you find anything about the usage by device? That it seems to me that a tablet with, like an iPad for seniors where you can, okay, we're going to zoom in now. You just, stretch it out and zoom might be, and the tools like FaceTime are certainly push button kind of thing. It's almost the exact opposite of its cousin, the phone, which gets so small that you can't, see anything on it, or fingers get in the way and so on.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question, and nor do I have in my head research that speaks to that. In a survey, if you ask people what devices you rely on, the mobile device always rates pretty highly because it's in your hand. You can use it to respond to that text or something like that. So it gets a lot of time, but it probably gets a lot less data than a tablet or a laptop, because on the tablet or laptop, that's when you're doing the FaceTime or watching a video or doing other kinds of applications that are more data intensive.
Good. Other questions? As Adrian and I get a little older, this is more and more important to us. So because we don't, we kind of think we're smart now, but in 5 years when something else comes out, the data shows we'll be slower to adopt those things.
Yeah,
Um,
that goes back to John's first point, which is the latest gadgets have the most up-to-date applications. Robbie will know that when we were sitting in an office, there was a lot of me going, Robbie, I need help. So it just goes to show you, you just have to have a youngster in your household to keep you, or in your office to keep you up to date on stuff. I'm glad I have, kids in their 20s to help me out. So, but not everybody does. And I do think there's also, John, I wanted to go back to an earlier point you made about sort of the trusted institutions and sometimes the response of counties, because we do have some counties in our Illinois group who have really stepped up trying to improve the services that they offer because more people are accessing those services online. So there's some interesting studies in a county in Cleveland. Oh boy, John, I'm spacing. I always want to say Cuyahoga, but I think is that right, Robbie?
That is right, yeah.
Oh, great, okay.
Yeah.
Where, they actually commissioned a study about should we invest in upgrading our services. And, once they did that, they found that more people were online paying their bills and signing up for the services. And there's a natural synergy between improvement of, what people are accessing and the interface and the ability to do things conveniently and people using those. And so, I think so much of our lives is about signing up for services online, paying bills online. This is why banking is incredibly important. I mean, I'm writing a few checks still, but boy, my kids don't write checks anymore. They're doing everything online. So that, I think, natural synergy is, happening amongst a certain age group. And that's why that literacy training, I think, is so much more important, as John pointed out at the beginning, maybe more so than to some degree the pricing, which, is also important, but I think the skills stuff rises up. Yeah.
And it's interesting, you think about traditionally digital literacy training and say, well, okay, we'll get you an email address and we'll show you how to Google something, and then we'll show you how to use Word.
Yeah.
Right. But now it's all about forms. How do you navigate forms and check boxes and those kind of things? So I think that's really important. The functional literacy is going to be measured in different ways. That will be, I think, some really interesting either in-depth research or just practitioners figuring it out what's really important to people. And it's like anything else, whether you design things for accessibility, that this senior accessibility is going to be super important.
Yeah. Yeah.
John, thank you so much.
Really appreciate it, John.
Thanks to Adrienne for recommending him.
Thank you.
presenter.
It was great.
Thank you very much. I'll stay on for as long as I can for Robbie's part, but thank you all very much for the great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was a great presentation.
Robbie, our expert on affordability and programs, EBB and what's coming down the pike.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us today, stepping up and doing a presentation.
No problem. Glad to do it because I think with this emergency broadband benefit program, a big hurdle right now is just getting the word out, raising awareness, explaining it, all that sort of stuff. So let me try to share my screen. Okay. And then everyone can see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Am I on the screen for people?
Yes.
Okay, it's always confusing for me, that, difference of everything. Okay, so yeah, this is going to be about emerging broadband affordability programs, focusing on the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, EBB. So just to give people a little legislative framework for what has come out a year ago in March 2020, the initial CARES Act came out, which was the immediate sort of funding around things that had a lot of COVID telehealth funding and the likes. And then at the very end of the year in the Appropriations Act, or the Consolidated Appropriations Act, we saw another round of checks that went out, and included in that was this direction that Congress gave to the FCC to establish the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And now, as John had mentioned, President Biden should be signing the American Rescue Plan Act, which will further do a few different things, which we'll touch on. But I just want people to realize that it's the December Consolidated Appropriations Act that this came from. So here's a timeline specifically on the program. December, Congress passes that big omnibus bill that contains a directive for the FCC to create this emergency broadband benefit program. In January, the FCC released a public notice asking for comment about, okay, what should we be, how should we be implementing this program? What should be considered? Benton and the Illinois Office of Broadband submitted comments. The program got developed further in February with reply comments due. And then on the 26th, the FCC officially released the rules. So this is all still new, being digested. They've released milestones for providers. And the big news is they aim to launch the program May 1st. So that's kind of the big thing coming up for people to pay attention to, at least from the timeline. So from now until then, it's going to be a lot of explaining, raising awareness, getting folks onto the ground. So as I mentioned, it's the EBB, Emergency Broadband Benefit. It's supposed to be an emergency response to help households struggling to pay for internet service during the pandemic. So I'm going to kind of give the recipient perspective and then the provider perspective. So if you receive this emergency broadband benefit program, what it is a one-time, households will receive up to $50 a month on a discount for broadband services, $75 for tribal. So this can be applied to a service that's less than $50. It can be applied to your bill, even if your bill is more than $50. The idea is it's a $50 discount so that you can maintain your broadband connection during the struggling, particularly the economic struggles of the pandemic. Additionally, there's a one-time discount for up to $100 for a laptop, a computer, or a tablet purchased through the provider that is participating in the program. And these have to be Wi-Fi enabled and support video conferencing. From the providers, the idea is you have these plans. You can't make up a new plan, but the idea is if you had plans that were in response to the pandemic, so whether or not you participated in the Keep Americans Connected pledge that the former FCC chairman adopted, or you have any sort of low income discount plan, you offer these, you say that you want to participate, and then you get, money essentially from the FCC, and then ultimately that's passed on to consumers. So it's a reimbursement process. Rental fee, all that sort of stuff. The idea is it's basically just helping people with their internet bills. And the main thing that I think is important for people on this call to be aware of is that I don't think there's consensus or anything about like, oh, this will be a smashing success, or, like all these sorts of things. So I think how we define success will be how much we put into it as a country. And so getting buy-in from both recipients and providers is important here. So providers in your area have to know about it in order to offer it. You can't just ask, let's say Frontier or some other place is offering a really great discount program, but you don't have Frontier service in your neighborhood. You ultimately cannot get the benefit through that. It has to be kind of a local oriented thing. So providers and recipients both, there's an awareness campaign that needs to happen. Okay, eligibility. So the idea is like, how do we determine who qualifies for this subsidy? So I'm going to be talking about Lifeline a little bit in more depth in this presentation, but the idea is the whole framework for this program is built on the FCC's Lifeline program. And the Lifeline program is basically a low-income, small subsidy. So any sort of like government subsidy geared towards people with lower incomes ultimately will qualify for this. So this can be Medicaid, SNAP, veterans pensions, public housing assistance. Additionally, the free and reduced lunch program is, I know with the work that we've been doing with a lot of different ICCs, that's been a very pivotal access point into recognizing the digital divide in certain communities. If you know which students are receiving free and reduced lunches, that's a very quick way to sort of be able to extend benefits really easily, in this case, the emergency broadband benefit. It's also targeting households that experience a substantial loss of income. So we had mentioned in the policy world, it can be easier to try to connect students, which this program does, but also this program, you know, it is ultimately an emergency program. So even households that experienced a substantial loss of income, either, you know, heavily reduced hours or losing their job in the wake of COVID, the idea is that this can help cover your internet bills so you can stay connected. Federal Pell Grant isn't something that we normally talk about very often in this space, but for people that work, you know, with higher education institutions, this can be a really, really effective way to raise awareness and just kind of connect with another institution within your communities to reach a particular population. And then this is basically just kind of, you know, if they've met the requirements under an original COVID-19 program for these services. And so if you're looking at how to sign up, it's basically around the Lifeline framework. So if you are enrolled in Lifeline, if you're receiving that $9.25 subsidy, you're automatically eligible for the emergency broadband benefit. You just have to affirmatively opt in for this new program. And there's links that you can find out this information. So if you're working with people with lower incomes and you have a computer available, you can ultimately just go to these websites and figure it out. So as mentioned, I've been saying Lifeline throughout this presentation. So I just wanted to give a background too, in case people are not aware of this program. The history of the Federal Communications is one in which universal service has always been a primary goal. That's why a lot of people are wanting to see it around broadband, and it has become political, but the history of the organization is, you know, more or less, how do we provide universal service to communications networks? So the FCC has what's called a Universal Service Fund, and they have a variety of different programs that ultimately try to kind of reach everybody with basic telecommunications services through that Universal Service Fund. So Lifeline is one of the programs under the Universal Service Fund, and it specifically is targeting people with lower incomes. So you get $9.25 to help, you know, either telecommunication or broadband services. So this is most commonly seen with cell phone, just very kind of cheap wireless plans. People are able to receive cell phones with a wireless subscription plan under the Lifeline program. They manage who's eligible, who can receive it, how they can participate. And it's all through these websites. And I would like to say I have a list of these resources at the end, because that frequently comes up. What are all the links that you put on? It'll be the last slide of the presentation. So if there are any providers on, or if you want to talk to providers, you'll have to know how they can become eligible. So part of the idea, I think, behind the Illinois Connected Communities is you've been in contact with some of the local providers in your area. And so you can either send them you know, this presentation, or use it to kind of create the connection with them about how they can get eligible. So if they offer any type of services, chances are they are eligible. Sorry, hold on. To participate in the emergency broadband benefit service. If they already participate in a program like Lifeline, they just need to say, we want to participate in the emergency broadband benefit program. And so this is where some of the alphabet soup comes in with all of these programs, but they'll have to be what's known as an eligible telecommunications carrier. So providers, if you're familiar with this language and you know that you are, then you're all set. You can just kind of join. Otherwise, you have to say, hey, we want to apply. There's an application process, and that actually just went live today. But the idea is if you did some sort of COVID discount program, then your program will be automatically approved. So again, the idea is basically if you're a provider and you've been doing any sort of response, any sort of low cost response during this coronavirus pandemic, you'll be approved, and then you can go ahead and receive the reimbursement component of the subsidy. So how to apply, I sort of just went through it. If you're an ETC, you tell USAC, which is the corporation, the nonprofit that runs this sort of thing, that you want to participate. Otherwise, you can now start applying if you're not an ETC, and do it. And even if you don't get it in before March 22nd, they'll be reviewing it on a rolling basis, and you can kind of get this out and get this going. So for providers, they can go here, get more information. A lot of questions around, well, how long is this program going to last? It was 3.2 billion is what Congress allocated for this program. So it's either when that money is up or 6 months after Congress officially declares the emergency period over. And I have not heard anything about a timeline for that. So for the foreseeable future, you know, this is going to be there. And so what can you do if you're on this webinar, or if you want to communicate to different people on your steering committee or local leaders in your area? Right now, it's really an information challenge. So staying informed is one of the best things that you can do. So we have the Illinois Broadband Connections newsletter that goes out bi-weekly every other Monday. I think the 22nd will be the next one. So make sure you subscribe to that, because we're going to be communicating with, you know, essentially every community in Illinois that wants to be updated on broadband. We're going to be communicating different deadlines and different information as we get it around the program. The Benton Institute, where I work, we have our weekly digest that goes out every Friday, and we've featured a couple different articles on the EBB, and we will continue to do so. And then if you're interested in this and all hosts of other broadband policy news, digital divide news, we have a daily free newsletter that goes out to, you know, everyone's inbox. So we recommend signing that up. Links will be at the end. And then I'm sure there's going to be continued webinars that are going to touch on it from Illinois Extension and the Illinois Office of Broadband. And then right now in your communities, I think it's really about just being aware of this, and then kind of planning and prepping and making sure that you're making the connections now with relevant organizations and providers. So if you know of different organizations that do benefit programs, like I said, either SNAP, Medicaid, housing, any sort of assistance types programs, this can help kind of just be another resource for people looking to receive help to pay their internet bills during this emergency. And then you can also kind of do some initial research of like, okay, which providers in our area are Lifeline ETCs? How can I learn more about the Lifeline program? And just sort of kind of laying the framework in your community so that you can communicate quickly once more details come out. And then you can also be an outreach partner. We will be an outreach partner. We don't know exactly what that means, but I think it's just sort of, you know, joining the sort of communication infrastructure to get awareness out around this program. When Bill had initially said, hey, you should do this program, there was also this included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act was a bunch of different broadband infrastructure and larger federal broadband updates. And so part of this presentation was going to cover some of those, but right now details are still somewhat sparse as to a lot of these programs, and they don't necessarily touch on adoption as much as infrastructure and these sorts of things, but we will continue to be monitoring, with the main idea being I'm going to be participating on a big webinar on the 17th. So next Wednesday, that's going to be discussing these programs. So similarly, if you're connected to those information channels I shared earlier, you'll have a little bit more update to what's happening at other areas within the federal government that are looking at broadband infrastructure and affordability and adoption issues. So this gets me to one of the like kind of final ideas behind this, which is additionally, with the Consolidation Appropriations Act, we now have the thing that Joe Biden is hopefully going to be signing this afternoon, the American Rescue Plan Act, and that includes $7.6 billion targeting the homework gap. And so I had mentioned the Universal Service Fund and how Lifeline is one of those programs. E-rate is another program, and it's this idea of, okay, how do we make sure that all schools and libraries have adequate internet connection? So there's big debate about what providing service to a classroom means now that the classroom has shifted. So a lot of those details will be worked out. The previous FCC said, that doesn't mean that we can supply hotspots for students. The new FCC will probably interpret that differently and say, because classrooms have moved to living rooms, is there a role that the FCC can ultimately play in this? So stay tuned for all this, because we just published this, in this morning's newsletter, these reactions about E-rate being included and having just passed. So as an example, I don't know if everyone remembers the old newspaper twirly things. This was from today, it's now open, the USAC provider election process. So if you want to get your application in, I just mentioned the homework gap. That was yesterday that came out. Today, there's news about a $94 billion legislative bill to improve internet access and internet infrastructure that we're going to be monitoring. Peter Welch out of Virginia just introduced a bill. Anna Eshoo out of California and others have done a local community's broadband network. So right now there's a huge flurry, and this is all in the last 1 or 2 days. So there's going to be further sort of responses, some of them related to adoption, some of them related to infrastructure, but the point being there's a lot. So right now, focusing on the emergency broadband benefit, I think is useful for folks. So this is the final page. These are all hyperlinked so that when this PDF is shared either as a PDF or when this PowerPoint is shared either as a PDF or anything else, these will be clickable and we'll have them on hand. But I don't know if you can see my mouse. We have the newsletters up. I think kind of anybody that's watching this ultimately should be subscribed to all 3 of those. Further reading, those are some analysis that Benton did. The upcoming webinars, there's a part 1 and a part 2. Lifeline links to just kind of get more information, see if there are people in your community that you could help, subscribe to that. And then the providers, because they're an equal part of this, how can they get information and sign up? So it's all right there if anybody has any questions. Thanks. Any questions? I can't see the chat, so I'm going to stop my screen right now.
Robbie, is there any database that people can go look at and see which providers are in the Lifeline program right now?
Yes, I don't know if I have the very specific link, but there is, I believe it'll be in either the links at the end or earlier in the presentation, where you can literally just put in your zip code or your street address, and it puts a list of all the different providers in the area that are offering Lifeline.
Oh, good. It's as a community leader, part of this effort, a lot of the communities have been talking with their providers. It'd be really great just to nudge them a little bit and say, hey, we've got a lot of people in our community that could use this benefit. Let's see how much we can bring into the community. Any dollars that aren't spent here can be spent on groceries or, so getting those subsidies is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think some people see this maybe as a criticism or not, but I think there is the angle of, if you get more people to subscribe to your service, regardless of like when this program ends, they'll theoretically be more inclined to adopt and use these services. So it is a win-win at the end of the day for both, people trying to get online and for providers just trying to expand their business in certain areas.
And this is different, usually like Comcast Internet Essentials. If you already have internet with Comcast, you can't all of a sudden qualify. But this is different than that. This is
right. Yep. Yeah, no. So anybody that qualifies for that, like this money can ultimately go towards that.
Good. Well, maybe we can follow this up and create a little, 3 or 4 strategies a community can undertake with senior groups, or, would certainly be a big conduit, or push that out through as many channels as we can. You think even if this lasts 8 months, that would be $400 in people's pockets.
Right. And I think it's kind of, we can do as much as we can around free Wi-Fi, or, just sort of doing those initial infrastructure access points. But if people cannot ultimately afford it, cost, as we've mentioned, is the number one cause of lack of broadband adoption. So reducing the cost for a lot of folks can go a long way to increasing adoption in your communities.
So remind me again, so do people sign up then through the FCC, and then but the money goes to the provider?
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And then the provider gives a discount, credits
Yep.
people on their bill.
And then they get their money back from the federal government bill. That's right. It's not a voucher program. They're not giving money to you, to the consumer, to then apply to a bill. Right. And you sign up through the National Lifeline Verifier. Right.
Yep.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, these are, I guess, and some people used to say they call them Obama phones in a derogatory term, but these must just be, maybe they'll call these Biden bites or something when they.
Actually, Bill, they called them Obama phones, but this Lifeline program was set up under Reagan.
Well,
and
yes.
expanded under George Bush.
Exactly. That's the big,
right. So
that's the big funny thing of it. Yeah.
Right. Then it got labeled as an Obama phone. I do see Nancy's question was, this is the same program that offered mobile phones in the 2010s? The answer is yes. And then you're saying, will they roll out enrollment online? That's the Lifeline verifier, Nancy. And then it says, is it within IDHS, which I'm assuming you're saying is the Illinois Department of Human Services. That I don't know, Nancy. That's a question I don't know. And I think there's a big scramble again that states need to be involved and localities need to be involved, as Robbie says, to publicize not only that the program is available to consumers, but also to get providers to be involved, because that needs to match. I mean, one of the big questions, for instance, is Comcast has the Internet Essentials program. They would automatically be enrolled in that, but they've never been a Lifeline provider before. And so they'll have to, so they're not in that classification of being an ETC. So the question is, are they going to do this, right?
And presumably they will, because they did so much with the pledge and all that sort of stuff initially. So.
Correct. But there's some hoop jumping that needs to go through it. Hopefully, we'll get a lot of traction on this. There are those of us in the policy world that would like to make this a permanent program. So even though this is labeled as an emergency, the question is, 925, which is the current Lifeline subsidy, doesn't buy you a lot. So will we either say it's 50 plus 925, or maybe Lifeline becomes phones and the EBB turns into a broadband subsidy? But the whole point is, cost is the single biggest barrier for adoption, and we need to particularly not just treat this as an emergency, but to address a longer term problem.
Good, thank you. I see James Zielinski on from Housing Authority of Champaign County. James, is a Housing Authority in working with your clients, any reaction to all this information today?
Hey, Bill.
Hi, sorry to catch you by surprise, but that's my specialty.
Oh, no, it's all good. I know I'm stepping in for Stephanie today. We're kind of doing different meetings. That actually will be the resources that were shared today. We're kind of focusing on the seniors So the different information that was shared today will definitely be helpful.
Good, good.
Yeah, James, I do think that this $50 subsidy, letting seniors who generally can sit in that low income category, particularly for your, Housing Authority of Champaign County clients, having them learn about and sign up for this EBB subsidy would be just fantastic.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, it's great to see all these new programs rolling out, like the one Robbie was discussing with the that came out with the new bill that just passed. So it's exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Anyone else have questions or comments or Basin questions for Robbie?
I have to leave, but I just want to say, Robbie, that was terrific. Thank you very much for agreeing to do it. And Bill, I'm sorry to leave. I think this was a small but mighty group and a lot of good questions, and all of the recordings will get up on the website. But thank you again. I just have a 1:30, so I got to do a little prep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Adrienne. Nancy, I think you can stop recording.